Sarah Martinez never imagined her investigative journalism career would lead her to this moment. Standing on the edge of a helicopter door at 3,000 feet above the dense Amazon rainforest, she could feel the rush of wind threatening to pull her into the void below. The assignment had seemed straightforward when her editor at Global Truth magazine first pitched it to her 6 months ago in their cramped New York office. Drug cartels are using helicopters to dispose of witnesses, her editor had said, sliding a thin folder across his cluttered desk. We need someone to go deep, get the real story. You're the only one crazy enough to do it. Sarah had built her reputation on dangerous assignments. From war zones in Syria to human trafficking rings in Eastern Europe, she had always found a way to get the story that others couldn't. But this assignment felt different from the moment she stepped off the plane in Bogotá, Colombia. The cartels had evolved their methods of eliminating threats. No longer content with simple executions, they had developed a signature method that sent a clear message to anyone who dared cross them. Victims would be taken up in helicopters and thrown out over remote jungle areas where their bodies would never be found. The psychological impact on communities was devastating. Sarah spent weeks building contacts in the criminal underworld, posing as a corrupt American businesswoman looking to establish drug transportation routes. Her fluent Spanish, learned during her childhood in Texas border towns, helped her blend in seamlessly. She had convinced the local cartel lieutenant, a man known only as El Vibora, that she had connections with shipping companies along the Gulf Coast. The deception worked too well. El Vibora began trusting her with increasingly sensitive information about their operations. Sarah learned about their helicopter disposal methods, their routes, their safe houses, and, most importantly, their planned expansion into new territories. She gathered enough evidence to bring down the entire operation, photographing documents and recording conversations with a hidden camera disguised as a designer watch. Everything changed on a humid Tuesday morning when Sarah received an urgent message to meet El Vibora at a remote airstrip outside the city. She had been expecting this meeting, thinking it would be her final intelligence-gathering session before she could safely extract herself from the operation and publish her exposé. The helicopter was already running when she arrived at the airstrip. El Vibora stood beside it with 3 other men she didn't recognize, all wearing dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Something felt wrong immediately. The usual casual atmosphere was replaced by a tense formality that made Sarah's investigative instincts scream danger. "We're taking a little trip," El Vibora said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There's someone you need to meet about our business arrangement." Sarah knew she had no choice but to get in the helicopter. Refusing would immediately blow her cover and likely result in immediate execution. She climbed into the aircraft, her mind racing through possible escape scenarios while maintaining her composed exterior. As the helicopter lifted off and headed toward the jungle, Sarah tried to engage El Vibora in conversation about their supposed business deal. His responses were short and increasingly hostile. The other men remained silent, but she could feel their eyes on her constantly. 20 minutes into the flight, one of the men pulled out a smartphone and showed El Vibora something on the screen. Sarah couldn't see what it was, but El Vibora's expression darkened immediately. He leaned forward and spoke rapidly in Spanish to the pilot, gesturing angrily. "You know, Sarah," El Vibora said, turning to face her with cold eyes, "we did some checking on your shipping company connections." Sarah's blood ran cold. She maintained eye contact while her mind raced through her cover story, looking for any possible holes they might have discovered. "Turns out, your company doesn't exist," he continued. "Neither do your shipping contacts. But you know what does exist? Your byline on articles about cartel operations in Mexico and Guatemala." The game was over. Sarah realized they had discovered her true identity as an investigative journalist. Her years of experience in dangerous situations kicked in, and she began assessing the helicopter's interior for anything that could be used as a weapon or aid in escape. "We don't like journalists," El Vibora said, standing up and moving toward the helicopter's open door. "Especially ones who think they can infiltrate our operations and write stories about us. One of the other men grabbed Sarah's arms, pulling her toward the door. The ground was a green blur 3,000 feet below. She could see the endless expanse of Amazon rainforest stretching to the horizon, with no signs of civilization anywhere. "This is how we deal with people who betray our trust," Elvabora shouted over the noise of the rotor blades. "You wanted to know about our helicopter disposal method? Now you get to experience it firsthand." Sarah's military training, something she had kept hidden throughout her journalism career, suddenly became relevant in ways she never expected. Before becoming a journalist, she had served 4 years in the Navy as a communications specialist. More importantly, she had volunteered for additional training with SEAL teams, including advanced parachuting and survival techniques. During her service, Sarah had completed over 50 training jumps, including high-altitude, low-opening exercises and emergency bailout procedures. She had learned to remain calm under extreme pressure and to assess dangerous situations quickly. The training had been intense, designed to prepare personnel for the worst-case scenarios in combat situations. As the men forced her toward the helicopter door, Sarah's training took over. She stopped struggling and instead began calculating wind speed, altitude, and terrain features below. The helicopter was moving at approximately 120 miles per hour at an altitude she estimated to be just over 3,000 feet. "Any last words, journalist?" Elvabora asked, his hand on her back ready to push. Sarah looked him in the eye and said calmly, "Yeah, you should have done your homework better." Before he could react, Sarah grabbed the door frame and threw herself out of the helicopter, controlling her exit to avoid the tail rotor. Elvabora and his men watched in shock as she disappeared into the clouds below, assuming they had just witnessed a woman's desperate and futile attempt to control her own death. What they didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had just executed a textbook emergency bailout procedure, and her real survival story was just beginning. The years of SEAL Freefall training that she had endured during her military service were about to be put to the ultimate test in the most dangerous environment on Earth. The first few seconds of freefall were the most critical. Sarah's body instinctively assumed the stable spread position she had practiced hundreds of times during her SEAL training exercises at the Naval Special Warfare Facility in Coronado. Arms extended, legs spread wide, back arched slightly to create maximum air resistance and stability. Her mind automatically began running through the emergency procedures drilled into her during countless training sessions. Check altitude, assess wind conditions, identify landing zones, control descent rate. The procedures had become muscle memory during her military service, repeated so often they could be executed without conscious thought, even under extreme stress. The Amazon rainforest stretched endlessly below her, a green carpet that looked deceptively soft from this altitude. Sarah knew the reality was far different. The jungle canopy consisted of trees reaching heights of over 200 feet, their interlocking branches creating a nearly impenetrable barrier that could break bones or impale an unprepared person attempting to penetrate it. Without a parachute, Sarah had perhaps 90 seconds before impact. Her terminal velocity would reach approximately 120 miles per hour, the same speed she would achieve in a normal skydiving scenario. The difference was that she would maintain that speed all the way to the ground unless she could find a way to slow her descent. During her SEAL training, instructors had taught emergency landing techniques for situations exactly like this: water landings, tree canopy penetration, and even techniques for surviving falls into dense vegetation. The training had seemed academic at the time, something that would never actually be needed in real combat situations. Sarah scanned the jungle below, looking for any features that might increase her chances of survival. Rivers were ideal for water landings, but she could see none within her current trajectory. Open clearings would provide the safest landing zones, but, again, none were visible in the dense forest canopy. Her best option appeared to be a section of jungle where the tree canopy looked slightly less dense than the surrounding areas. If she could control her descent path to reach that zone, she might be able to use the branches to slow her fall in stages rather than hitting the ground at full speed. The wind conditions were relatively calm, which worked in her favor. Strong winds would have made it nearly impossible to control her descent path with any precision. Sarah began making subtle adjustments to her body position, shifting her arms and legs to create directional movement through the air. Navigation during freefall required understanding how air currents moved around the human body. By extending her right arm slightly and drawing her left arm closer to her body, Sarah could create a turning motion that would gradually alter her descent path. The technique was called tracking, and it allowed experienced skydivers to move horizontally through the air while falling. As she fell through 2,000 feet, Sarah could begin to make out individual trees in the canopy below. The forest looked even more intimidating from this distance, with massive tree trunks and a thick understory that would make movement extremely difficult once she reached the ground. Her military survival training included extensive instruction on jungle navigation and survival techniques. The Amazon rainforest was one of the most challenging environments on Earth, with thousands of species of poisonous plants and animals, limited visibility due to the dense canopy, and virtually no landmarks for navigation. Sarah knew that even if she survived the landing, her chances of making it out of the jungle alive were extremely small. The nearest civilization could be hundreds of miles away in any direction, and without proper equipment or supplies, most people would die within days of exposure, dehydration, or infection from the countless dangerous organisms that inhabited the forest. But survival was a problem for later. Right now, her immediate concern was reaching the ground in one piece. Sarah continued making small adjustments to her body position, gradually steering her descent toward the area where the canopy appeared most penetrable. At 1,000 feet, she could clearly see the structure of individual trees. Her target area contained several large trees with extensive branch networks that might provide multiple contact points to slow her descent. The key would be hitting the branches in sequence, using each one to reduce her speed gradually rather than attempting to stop her fall all at once. Sarah mentally rehearsed the canopy penetration technique she had learned during survival training. The goal was to hit the uppermost branches with her feet first, using the natural flexibility of the smaller branches to absorb some of her kinetic energy. As she broke through successive layers of the canopy, she would need to protect her head and vital organs while allowing the branches to slow her descent. The technique required precise timing and body control. Too much resistance too quickly could result in severe injuries, as her body was violently redirected by large branches. Too little resistance would mean hitting the ground at nearly full speed, which would be fatal regardless of the terrain below. At 500 feet, Sarah could hear the sound of the wind rushing through the tree leaves below. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and other wildlife, completely unaware of the human projectile about to crash through their domain. Sarah drew her arms and legs into a more compact position as she approached the canopy, protecting her extremities from the initial impact with branches. Her years of training had taught her to remain calm and focused even in life-threatening situations, and that mental discipline was now the most important factor in her survival. The first branch she encountered was a small, flexible limb near the top of the canopy. It bent dramatically under her weight, but didn't break, providing just enough resistance to begin slowing her descent. Sarah allowed her body to rotate slightly, using the branch as a pivot point to redirect her path toward a thicker branch lower in the tree. The second impact was more violent. A branch the thickness of her arm caught her across the ribs, knocking the wind out of her lungs and spinning her body horizontally. The pain was immediate and intense, but Sarah forced herself to remain focused on controlling her descent rather than assessing her injuries. Branch after branch broke her fall in stages, each impact reducing her speed but also inflicting damage to her body. Sarah's military training had prepared her to function through pain and injury, and she used every technique she had learned to maintain control as she crashed through the forest canopy. A particularly large branch caught her across the back, and she felt something snap in her shoulder. The pain was excruciating, but she managed to grab onto smaller branches with her good arm, further slowing her descent. Her legs were cut and bruised from repeated impacts with branches and tree trunks, but they remained functional. 20 feet above the forest floor, Sarah encountered a thick network of vines and smaller branches that acted like a natural net. Her speed had been reduced to perhaps 20 miles per hour, still dangerous but no longer necessarily fatal. She crashed through this final barrier and hit the ground hard, rolling instinctively to distribute the impact across her body. The forest floor was surprisingly soft, covered with decades of fallen leaves and decaying vegetation that provided some cushioning. Sarah lay still for several minutes, conducting a mental inventory of her injuries and listening for any sounds that might indicate the helicopter had landed to search for her body. Her left shoulder was definitely dislocated or broken, and she could feel numerous cuts and bruises across her entire body. Her ribs were painful, possibly cracked, and her right ankle was swollen and difficult to move. But she was alive, conscious, and capable of movement. The freefall training had saved her life. In the distance, she could hear the fading sound of the helicopter rotor as Elvabora and his men flew away, undoubtedly convinced that no one could survive a fall from that height into the jungle. They would report her death to their superiors and consider the problem of the American journalist permanently solved. Sarah slowly pushed herself into a sitting position, wincing at the pain from her injured shoulder. The jungle around her was dense and humid, filled with the sounds of insects and distant bird calls. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy far above, creating a dappled pattern of light and shadow on the forest floor. She was alone in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth, injured and without any survival equipment. But she was alive, and her military training had given her the knowledge and skills necessary to survive in hostile territory. The real test was just beginning. The first priority in any survival situation was immediate medical attention for life-threatening injuries. Sarah carefully examined her wounds, starting with her dislocated shoulder. The joint had been forced out of its socket during her impact with one of the larger branches, and the pain was making it difficult to think clearly. Using a technique learned during military medical training, Sarah positioned herself against a large tree trunk and used her body weight to pop the shoulder back into place. The process was excruciating, but the relief was immediate once the joint was properly aligned. She fashioned a crude sling from vines to immobilize the shoulder and prevent further injury. Her ankle was severely sprained but not broken, and the cuts on her legs and arms were superficial despite the significant bleeding. Sarah used leaves from plants she recognized as having natural antibiotic properties to clean the wounds, then bound them with strips of fabric torn from her clothing. The dense jungle canopy blocked most of the sunlight, making it difficult to determine the exact time of day. Based on the angle of the few sunbeams that penetrated the canopy, Sarah estimated it was mid-afternoon. She had perhaps 4 hours of daylight remaining before the forest would become completely dark. Water was the most immediate survival priority. Without access to clean drinking water, Sarah would become dangerously dehydrated within days, especially in a humid jungle environment where the body loses water rapidly through perspiration. She listened carefully for the sound of running water, which would indicate a stream or river nearby. The jungle was filled with sounds, but Sarah's trained ear could distinguish between the calls of different birds, the rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush, and the subtle sound of water moving over rocks. After several minutes of careful listening, she detected what might be a small stream somewhere to the northeast of her current position. Moving through the jungle required extreme caution. The forest floor was uneven and covered with fallen logs, tangled vines, and hidden obstacles that could cause further injury to her already damaged ankle. Venomous snakes, poisonous spiders, and other dangerous creatures were common in this environment, and Sarah had no protective equipment or medical supplies to treat bites or stings. Sarah's survival training had included extensive instruction on jungle navigation techniques. Without a compass, she used the position of the sun and the growth patterns of moss and vegetation to maintain her sense of direction. Trees and plants grew differently depending on their exposure to sunlight, and experienced jungle travelers could use these natural indicators to navigate even in dense forest. The sound of water grew stronger as Sarah carefully made her way through the undergrowth, using her uninjured arm to push aside branches and vines. The humidity was oppressive, and she was soon soaked with sweat despite moving slowly to conserve energy and avoid further injury. After 20 minutes of difficult travel, Sarah reached a small stream that flowed through a natural clearing in the forest. The water appeared clean and was moving rapidly over a rocky bottom, both good indicators that it was safe to drink. She carefully approached the stream, watching for any signs of dangerous animals that might be using it as a water source. The stream was perhaps 3 feet wide and 6 inches deep, fed by springs somewhere higher in the jungle. Sarah cupped her hands and drank deeply, feeling the cool water ease the dehydration that had begun to affect her thinking. She also used the water to clean her wounds more thoroughly and to cool her body temperature. While resting beside the stream, Sarah began developing a long-term survival strategy. Her immediate needs were water, shelter, and food in that order. The stream solved her water requirements as long as she remained in this area. Shelter would be critical for protection from rain, insects, and dangerous animals during the night. Food was a more complex problem. The jungle contained numerous edible plants and fruits, but it also contained many that were toxic or even deadly. Sarah's survival training had included instruction on identifying safe foods in tropical environments, but her knowledge was limited compared to indigenous peoples who had lived in these forests for thousands of years. The clearing around the stream provided several advantages for establishing a temporary shelter. The open area would allow her to see approaching animals or other threats, and the flowing water would mask sounds that might attract unwanted attention. Sarah began gathering materials for a basic lean-to shelter that would provide protection from rain and wind. Using her uninjured arm and her knowledge of field construction techniques, Sarah built a framework of sturdy branches and covered it with large leaves and sections of bark peeled from dead trees. The shelter was small, but would provide adequate protection for one person during the night hours. As she worked on the shelter, Sarah's mind was already planning her escape from the jungle. Her best option was to follow the stream downhill, as most streams in this region eventually flowed into larger rivers that might be used by local inhabitants for transportation. If she could reach a navigable river, she might encounter boats or settlements. The alternative was to attempt overland travel toward the nearest road or town, but without detailed maps or knowledge of the local geography, this approach was extremely risky. The Amazon jungle was vast, and travelers could easily walk in circles for days without making any real progress towards civilization. Sarah's hidden camera and recording equipment had been lost during her fall through the forest canopy, but she still carried the evidence she had gathered about the cartel's operations in her memory. If she could survive long enough to reach safety, she would still be able to publish the exposé that had nearly cost her life. As darkness began to fall, the jungle transformed into a completely different environment. The sounds of day birds were replaced by the calls of nocturnal animals, many of which Sarah couldn't identify. Insects became more active, and she could hear the movement of larger animals through the forest around her clearing. Sarah gathered dry wood for a small fire, using techniques learned during survival training to create flame without matches or lighter. The fire would provide warmth, protection from animals, and a psychological boost during the long night ahead. She was careful to keep the fire small to avoid attracting unwanted attention from any humans who might be searching the area. The pain from her injuries made it difficult to find a comfortable position, but Sarah managed to rest in her shelter while maintaining awareness of her surroundings. Every sound in the jungle could represent a potential threat, from the harmless rustling of small creatures to the approach of jaguars or other predators that hunted at night. During her military service, Sarah had endured similar nights in hostile territory, staying alert for enemy movement while trying to rest enough to maintain her strength and mental clarity. The skills she had learned during those training exercises were now essential for her survival in this environment. As the night progressed, Sarah heard several sounds that indicated the presence of large animals moving through the forest near her location. She added wood to her fire and remained perfectly still, knowing that most jungle predators would avoid areas where humans had established a presence if given the choice. The stream continued flowing beside her shelter, providing both water and a constant background sound that would mask any noise she might make accidentally. Sarah used the time to plan her route for the following day, estimating distances and identifying potential hazards she might encounter while following the stream toward larger waterways. By dawn, Sarah had survived her first night in the Amazon jungle. Her injuries were painful but manageable, and she had successfully established a basic camp with water, shelter, and fire. The next phase of her survival would require traveling through unknown territory while avoiding the numerous dangers that inhabited this hostile environment. The real test of her military training and survival skills was just beginning. She had proven she could survive the initial crisis, but escaping from the jungle alive would require everything she had learned about navigation, survival, and maintaining hope in seemingly impossible situations. Dawn in the Amazon brought new challenges and opportunities. The jungle awakened with the calls of hundreds of bird species, the chattering of monkeys, and the rustling of countless insects beginning their daily activities. Sarah extinguished her fire and prepared to begin the most dangerous phase of her survival journey. Following the stream would provide her with a reliable water source and the best chance of eventually reaching human settlement. But it also meant traveling through terrain that she couldn't predict or control. Streams in the Amazon often passed through areas that were home to some of the most dangerous animals in the world. Sarah fashioned a crude walking stick from a straight branch to help support her injured ankle and provide balance while traversing uneven terrain. She also created a simple spear by sharpening one end of another branch, giving her at least some means of defense against aggressive animals. The stream flowed generally northeast, descending gradually through a series of small rapids and pools. Sarah moved slowly along the bank, testing each step carefully on the slippery rocks and muddy soil. A fall into the water could result in serious injury or attract the attention of caimans or other aquatic predators. Her military training had included instruction on movement techniques in hostile environments. Sarah applied these principles to her jungle travel, moving quietly and pausing frequently to observe her surroundings. She watched for signs of dangerous animals, checked for safe footing ahead, and constantly assessed potential escape routes if she encountered threats. The jungle canopy was so dense that Sarah often couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. This limited visibility made it impossible to spot dangers until she was very close to them, requiring extreme caution with every step. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of animals, from broken branches to unusual disturbances in the vegetation. After 2 hours of careful travel, Sarah encountered her first major obstacle. The stream disappeared over a steep waterfall into a deep pool surrounded by nearly vertical rock walls. The waterfall was perhaps 30 feet high, and there was no safe way to descend the cliff face with her injuries and limited equipment. Sarah was forced to leave the stream and attempt to find a way around the waterfall through the dense jungle. This meant traveling through unknown territory without the guidance of the watercourse, significantly increasing her risk of becoming lost in the vast forest. Using her compass skills learned during military navigation training, Sarah attempted to maintain a northeastern heading that would eventually bring her back to the stream below the waterfall. The jungle was so thick that she sometimes had to crawl under fallen trees or cut through tangled vines with sharp rocks. The detour took most of the morning and severely taxed her limited energy reserves. By the time Sarah found the stream again below the waterfall, she was exhausted and in significant pain from her injuries. She was forced to rest beside the water for nearly an hour before continuing her journey. During her rest stop, Sarah encountered her first wildlife crisis. A large snake, which she identified as a fer-de-lance based on its distinctive markings, was sunning itself on a rock directly in her path. The fer-de-lance was one of the most venomous snakes in Central and South America, and its bite would be fatal without immediate medical treatment. Sarah remained perfectly motionless while the snake completed its basking and eventually slithered away into the undergrowth. The encounter reminded her that death in the jungle could come from countless sources, many of them nearly impossible to predict or avoid. As she continued following the stream, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the vegetation and terrain that suggested she was gradually descending toward lower elevations. The trees were becoming larger and more diverse, and she occasionally heard the calls of different bird species that preferred river environments. Her food situation was becoming critical. Sarah had been surviving on what little edible vegetation she could safely identify, primarily certain fruits and nuts that her training had taught her to recognize. But her caloric intake was far below what her body needed to maintain strength and mental clarity while traveling through difficult terrain. Sarah's survival training had included instruction on fishing and trapping techniques that could be implemented with improvised equipment. She spent time creating a simple fish trap from branches and vines, designing it to funnel small fish from the stream into a confined area where they could be easily caught. The fish trap required several hours to construct and position properly, but by late afternoon, Sarah had caught 2 small fish that provided her first substantial protein in 2 days. She cooked them over a small fire, being careful to fully cook the meat to avoid parasites or bacterial infections. That evening, Sarah established her second jungle camp beside a wider section of the stream. The waterway had grown from a small creek to a stream nearly 10 feet wide, and she could see evidence that larger fish inhabited the deeper pools. This was encouraging, as it suggested she was moving toward more substantial waterways. During the night, Sarah was awakened by sounds that indicated large animals were moving through the forest nearby. The noises were unlike anything she had heard during her previous night in the jungle, including what sounded like the breaking of substantial branches and low vocalizations that could have been from jaguars or other big cats. Sarah remained perfectly still in her shelter, maintaining her small fire while listening to the animals moving through the darkness around her location. Her military training had taught her that most predators were opportunistic hunters who preferred easy prey, and a human who appeared alert and defended would usually be avoided if possible. The sounds continued for most of the night, sometimes coming very close to her camp before moving away again. Sarah never saw the animals clearly, but she found large paw prints in the mud near the stream the following morning, confirming that at least one jaguar had investigated her campsite during the night. The third day of travel brought new challenges as the stream merged with a larger waterway that was nearly 20 feet wide and too deep to cross safely. Sarah was forced to continue along one bank, hoping that the river would eventually lead her to human settlement or at least a terrain where rescue might be possible. The larger river moved more slowly than the stream, meandering through sections of dense jungle interspersed with occasional clearings. Sarah's progress was faster along the riverbank, but she also encountered new dangers, including caimans basking on muddy banks and aggressive species of ants that could deliver painful and potentially dangerous bites. Her injured shoulder was showing signs of infection despite her efforts to keep it clean and immobilized. The tropical environment was ideal for bacterial growth, and even minor wounds could quickly become life-threatening if not properly treated. Sarah used her remaining strips of cloth to create fresh bandages and applied plant medicines she had learned to identify during survival training. By the fourth day, Sarah's physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. The combination of inadequate food, constant stress, physical injuries, and the demanding environment was pushing her body beyond its limits. She was becoming lightheaded and having difficulty maintaining her usual level of alertness and decision-making ability. Despite her declining physical state, Sarah pressed forward along the river, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant almost certain death in the jungle. Her military training had included instruction on operating effectively while exhausted and stressed, and she drew on every technique she had learned to maintain her focus and determination. Late in the afternoon of the fourth day, Sarah heard a sound that changed everything. In the distance, barely audible over the natural sounds of the jungle, she could hear the put-put-put of an outboard motor. Somewhere ahead of her, there were humans operating boats on this river system. Sarah increased her pace despite her exhaustion, driven by the first real hope she had felt since beginning her jungle ordeal. The sound of the motor grew stronger as she continued downstream, and she began to see signs of human activity, including cut stumps where trees had been harvested and paths leading up from the riverbank. Just before sunset, Sarah rounded a bend in the river and saw the most beautiful sight of her life. A small wooden dock extending into the water, with several dugout canoes tied alongside it. Beyond the dock, she could see a path leading up to what appeared to be a small settlement hidden among the trees. Sarah had found civilization. Her survival skills, military training, and sheer determination had carried her through 4 days and nights in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. But her ordeal was not quite over. She still needed to convince the people in this remote settlement to help her, and she had no idea whether they were friendly to outsiders or connected to the same criminal organizations that had tried to kill her. Sarah approached the settlement with extreme caution, using her military reconnaissance training to observe the area before revealing herself. The village consisted of perhaps a dozen simple wooden structures built on stilts to protect them from seasonal flooding. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could hear the voices of women and children, which suggested this was a peaceful community rather than a criminal outpost. The inhabitants appeared to be indigenous people who lived by fishing and small-scale farming along the riverbank. Sarah could see gardens of cassava and plantains, fishing nets drying in the sun, and children playing near the water under the watchful eyes of their mothers. This was exactly the type of community she had hoped to find. However, Sarah also knew that her sudden appearance could cause panic or fear among people who rarely encountered outsiders, especially an injured foreign woman emerging from the jungle alone. She needed to approach the situation carefully to avoid being perceived as a threat or being turned away before she could explain her circumstances. Sarah decided to make herself visible from a distance and wait for the villagers to notice her, rather than walking directly into their community. She emerged from the tree line near the dock and sat down on a fallen log, making herself appear as non-threatening as possible while clearly indicating that she needed help. Within minutes, several children spotted her and ran back to the village, calling excitedly to the adults. Soon, a group of villagers approached cautiously, led by an elderly man who appeared to be a community leader. They spoke in indigenous dialect that Sarah didn't recognize, but their body language suggested curiosity rather than hostility. Sarah raised her uninjured hand in a universal gesture of peace and spoke slowly in Spanish, hoping that at least some of the villagers would understand. She explained that she had been in an airplane accident and had been walking through the jungle for several days trying to find help. The elderly leader responded in heavily accented but understandable Spanish, introducing himself as Carlos and explaining that his people were members of the Ticuna tribe who had lived along this river for many generations. He examined Sarah's injuries with the experienced eye of someone who had dealt with jungle accidents before. Carlos instructed several women to prepare food and clean water while he and other men helped Sarah to a shelter where she could rest. The villagers' immediate response was one of hospitality and concern for her welfare, confirming Sarah's assessment that she had found genuinely helpful people rather than criminals or hostile natives. Over the next several hours, Sarah received the best medical care available in the remote location. The village healer, an elderly woman named Maria, cleaned and rebandaged Sarah's wounds using traditional plant medicines that were remarkably effective. Her infected shoulder was treated with a paste made from local herbs that quickly reduced the swelling and pain. Sarah was fed fish soup and fruit that began to restore her strength after days of inadequate nutrition. She slept for nearly 12 hours straight, the first real rest she had experienced since her ordeal began. When she awakened, she felt significantly better both physically and mentally. Carlos explained that their village was located about 50 miles from the nearest town with road access and telephone communication. The river was navigable by motorboat to within about 20 miles of the town, where a rough trail connected to a logging road that eventually reached civilization. The villagers agreed to help Sarah reach safety, but the journey would require 2 days of travel by boat and foot. Carlos assigned 2 of his sons, experienced river guides named Miguel and Pedro, to escort Sarah to the town where she could contact authorities and arrange transportation back to her home country. Before departing, Sarah faced a critical decision about how much to tell the villagers about her real situation. She had told them she was in an airplane accident, which was partially true, but revealing that she was being pursued by drug cartels could put the entire village in danger if the criminals discovered they had helped her. Sarah decided to maintain her cover story while privately ensuring that she could provide financial compensation to the village for their assistance once she reached safety. These people had risked their own safety to help a stranger, and she was determined to find a way to repay their kindness. The boat journey began at dawn with Sarah, Miguel, and Pedro traveling downriver in a long dugout canoe equipped with a small outboard motor. The river passed through increasingly populated areas as they traveled toward the main transportation routes, and Sarah began to see signs of the modern world, including power lines and occasional bridges. After 8 hours of river travel, they reached a small trading post where the river intersected with a dirt road used by logging trucks. Miguel arranged for Sarah to ride with a truck driver who was heading toward the provincial capital, while Pedro returned to the village with the boat. The truck ride was uncomfortable and bumpy, but it covered in 2 hours what would have taken days to walk. Sarah finally reached a town with telephone service and a small police station where she could begin the process of contacting the outside world. Sarah's first call was to the American consulate in Bogotá, where she reported her situation and requested assistance in safely leaving the country. The consulate officials were initially skeptical of her story, but Sarah's press credentials and the evidence she provided about the cartel operation convinced them that she was indeed a journalist who had been targeted by criminals. Within hours, arrangements were made for Sarah to be transported to Bogotá under diplomatic protection. She was taken to a private clinic where she received proper medical treatment for her injuries, including surgery to repair damage to her shoulder and treatment for various infections she had acquired in the jungle. The story Sarah eventually published about the cartel's helicopter disposal methods became one of the most widely read investigative pieces of the year. Her detailed account of their operations, combined with the evidence she had gathered during her undercover work, led to international law enforcement operations that significantly disrupted the criminal organization. Elva Bora and several of his associates were arrested by Colombian authorities working in cooperation with American drug enforcement agencies. The helicopter they had used to throw Sarah from was seized as evidence, along with documentation that confirmed their involvement in numerous murders using this method. Sarah's survival story became almost as famous as her original investigation. Military survival schools began using her experience as a case study in applying training techniques to real-world emergency situations. Her combination of investigative courage and military-trained survival skills had enabled her to not only survive an impossible situation, but to complete her mission of exposing criminal activities. The village that had saved her life received a significant financial contribution that funded improvements to their school and medical facilities. Sarah maintained contact with Carlos and his family, visiting them several times over the following years to express her continued gratitude for their life-saving assistance. Sarah's experience in the Amazon changed her approach to investigative journalism. She became an advocate for improved safety training for journalists working in dangerous areas, and she established a foundation that provided survival training and equipment to reporters covering high-risk assignments around the world. The physical scars from her jungle ordeal eventually faded, but the psychological impact remained with Sarah for the rest of her career. She had faced death and survived through a combination of professional training, personal determination, and the kindness of strangers who owed her nothing, but chose to risk their own safety to help her. Sarah never returned to undercover work with criminal organizations, but she continued investigating dangerous stories using safer methods that didn't require her to infiltrate criminal groups directly. Her reputation as a journalist willing to risk everything for a story was enhanced by her proven ability to survive the consequences when those risks materialized into real danger. The helicopter incident became a defining moment in Sarah's life, demonstrating that the survival skills she had learned during military service were not just academic exercises, but potentially life-saving abilities that could be applied in the most extreme circumstances. Her story inspired countless others to pursue advanced survival training and to never give up hope even in seemingly impossible situations. Years later, when Sarah was asked about the most important factor in her survival, she always gave the same answer: preparation combined with the refusal to surrender. The technical skills she had learned during SEAL training provided the foundation for her survival, but her determination to live and complete her mission had provided the motivation to endure 4 days of hell in the Amazon jungle. Sarah Martinez had gone into the jungle as an investigative journalist, pursuing a story about criminal violence. She emerged as a symbol of human resilience and the power of proper training to overcome impossible odds. Her experience proved that sometimes the most important stories are not just the ones we set out to tell, but the ones we live through in the process of telling them. Sarah Martinez never imagined her investigative journalism career would lead her to this moment. Standing on the edge of a helicopter door at 3,000 feet above the dense Amazon rainforest, she could feel the rush of wind threatening to pull her into the void below. The assignment had seemed straightforward when her editor at Global Truth magazine first pitched it to her 6 months ago in their cramped New York office. Drug cartels are using helicopters to dispose of witnesses, her editor had said, sliding a thin folder across his cluttered desk. We need someone to go deep, get the real story. You're the only one crazy enough to do it. Sarah had built her reputation on dangerous assignments. From war zones in Syria to human trafficking rings in Eastern Europe, she had always found a way to get the story that others couldn't. But this assignment felt different from the moment she stepped off the plane in Bogota, Colombia. The cartels had evolved their methods of eliminating threats. No longer content with simple executions, they had developed a signature method that sent a clear message to anyone who dared cross them. Victims would be taken up in helicopters and thrown out over remote jungle areas where their bodies would never be found. The psychological impact on communities was devastating. Sarah spent weeks building contacts in the criminal underworld, posing as a corrupt American businesswoman looking to establish drug transportation routes. Her fluent Spanish, learned during her childhood in Texas border towns, helped her blend in seamlessly. She had convinced the local cartel lieutenant, a man known only as El Vibora, that she had connections with shipping companies along the Gulf Coast. The deception worked too well. El Vibora began trusting her with increasingly sensitive information about their operations. Sarah learned about their helicopter disposal methods, their routes, their safe houses, and, most importantly, their planned expansion into new territories. She gathered enough evidence to bring down the entire operation, photographing documents and recording conversations with a hidden camera disguised as a designer watch. Everything changed on a humid Tuesday morning when Sarah received an urgent message to meet Elvabora at a remote airstrip outside the city. She had been expecting this meeting, thinking it would be her final intelligence gathering session before she could safely extract herself from the operation and publish her exposé. The helicopter was already running when she arrived at the airstrip. Elvabora stood beside it with 3 other men she didn't recognize, all wearing dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Something felt wrong immediately. The usual casual atmosphere was replaced by a tense formality that made Sarah's investigative instincts scream danger. "We're taking a little trip," Elvabora said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There's someone you need to meet about our business arrangement." Sarah knew she had no choice but to get in the helicopter. Refusing would immediately blow her cover and likely result in immediate execution. She climbed into the aircraft, her mind racing through possible escape scenarios while maintaining her composed exterior. As the helicopter lifted off and headed toward the jungle, Sarah tried to engage Elvabora in conversation about their supposed business deal. His responses were short and increasingly hostile. The other men remained silent, but she could feel their eyes on her constantly. 20 minutes into the flight, one of the men pulled out a smartphone and showed Elvabora something on the screen. Sarah couldn't see what it was, but Elvabora's expression darkened immediately. He leaned forward and spoke rapidly in Spanish to the pilot, gesturing angrily. "You know, Sarah," Elvabora said, turning to face her with cold eyes, "we did some checking on your shipping company connections." Sarah's blood ran cold. She maintained eye contact while her mind raced through her cover story, looking for any possible holes they might have discovered. "Turns out, your company doesn't exist," he continued. "Neither do your shipping contacts. But you know what does exist? Your byline on articles about cartel operations in Mexico and Guatemala." The game was over. Sarah realized they had discovered her true identity as an investigative journalist. Her years of experience in dangerous situations kicked in, and she began assessing the helicopter's interior for anything that could be used as a weapon or aid in escape. "We don't like journalists," Elvabora said, standing up and moving toward the helicopter's open door, "especially ones who think they can infiltrate our operations and write stories about us." One of the other men grabbed Sarah's arms, pulling her toward the door. The ground was a green blur 3,000 feet below. She could see the endless expanse of Amazon rainforest stretching to the horizon, with no signs of civilization anywhere. "This is how we deal with people who betray our trust," Elvabora shouted over the noise of the rotor blades. "You wanted to know about our helicopter disposal method? Now you get to experience it firsthand." Sarah's military training, something she had kept hidden throughout her journalism career, suddenly became relevant in ways she never expected. Before becoming a journalist, she had served 4 years in the Navy as a communications specialist. More importantly, she had volunteered for additional training with SEAL teams, including advanced parachuting and survival techniques. During her service, Sarah had completed over 50 training jumps, including high-altitude, low-opening exercises, and emergency bailout procedures. She had learned to remain calm under extreme pressure and to assess dangerous situations quickly. The training had been intense, designed to prepare personnel for the worst-case scenarios in combat situations. As the men forced her toward the helicopter door, Sarah's training took over. She stopped struggling and instead began calculating wind speed, altitude, and terrain features below. The helicopter was moving at approximately 120 miles per hour at an altitude she estimated to be just over 3,000 feet. "Any last words, journalist?" Elvabora asked, his hand on her back ready to push. Sarah looked him in the eye and said calmly, "Yeah, you should have done your homework better." Before he could react, Sarah grabbed the door frame and threw herself out of the helicopter, controlling her exit to avoid the tail rotor. Elvabora and his men watched in shock as she disappeared into the clouds below, assuming they had just witnessed a woman's desperate and futile attempt to control her own death. What they didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had just executed a textbook emergency bailout procedure, and her real survival story was just beginning. The years of SEAL freefall training that she had endured during her military service were about to be put to the ultimate test in the most dangerous environment on Earth.